I want you to understand something before I tell you this story. I am not a woman who falls apart easily. I raised a child mostly alone after her father and I separated. I buried both my parents within 18 months of each other. I ran a small accounting firm for over 2 decades without asking anyone to carry weight that belonged to me. I have always been the kind of woman who holds herself together first and cries later, in private, where no one has to rearrange their face to manage my grief. I tell you this because what I am about to describe will sound, at first, like the story of a woman who lost her mind. I need you to know that I did not. It was 2:47 in the morning when my phone lit up the darkness of my bedroom. I know the exact time because I have replayed it so many times since that the numbers are carved into me permanently. The number on the screen meant nothing to me. No name attached to it. An area code I did not recognize. I almost did not answer. I was 54 years old, half asleep, and I had learned through 11 years of missing my daughter that hope arriving at the wrong hour is often just cruelty wearing a familiar face. But something in me moved before my mind could argue. I pressed the phone to my ear. One word came through. Mom. My entire body stopped. Not just my breathing. Everything. The word was older than I remembered it, rougher at the edges, like a voice that had been through weather I had not witnessed. But it was hers. I knew it the way you know your own heartbeat, not by thinking about it, but by the way your body simply recognizes it as part of itself. Nadia. My daughter. Missing for 11 years. Gone since she was 16 years old. I could not speak. My throat sealed itself completely. Mom, I don't have much time. I need you to listen. I need you to. The line went dead. I sat upright in the dark with the phone in both hands, shaking so hard the screen blurred in front of me. I called back immediately. An automated voice answered, calm and completely indifferent to what it was telling me. This number is not in service. I called again. And again. I called 47 times before the sun came up. Every single attempt hit the same wall of silence. But I had heard her. I knew what I had heard. And underneath the terror, underneath the shaking and the tears I did not even realize were running down my face, one question was already forming itself into something harder than grief. Something sharper. If Nadia was alive, what had she been living inside for 11 years? I did not sleep. I sat at my kitchen table with the lamp on and the number written on a piece of paper in front of me, and I looked at it the way you look at something that has the power to either save you or finish destroying you. I ran it through a reverse lookup website before dawn. The result came back within seconds. The registered owner of that number was a woman named Patricia Hale. Patricia Hale had died 3 years ago in Savannah, Georgia. I am an accountant. I have spent my entire career following numbers until they tell the truth, because numbers, unlike people, cannot sustain a lie indefinitely. There is always a thread. You pull it carefully, and eventually everything unravels in the right direction. That morning I pulled every thread I could find. Patricia Hale, 61 years old at the time of her death, had passed from natural causes. No children. No close living relatives except a distant niece she had reportedly not spoken to in years. Her estate had been handled by a public administrator. Her phone plan, I would later confirm, had been cancelled within weeks of her death. The number should not have existed anymore. Phone carriers retire inactive numbers, but they do not reactivate them for strangers without a paper trail. I called my phone carrier and spent 2 hours being transferred between departments, keeping my voice even and my questions precise, before a supervisor confirmed what I had already begun to suspect. The number had been reactivated 6 months ago through a prepaid service. The account had been created using a false name. It had been paid for in cash at a physical location. Someone had deliberately reactivated a dead woman's number, used it for one single call, and ensured it could never be traced back to them. I sat with that for a long moment. This was not accidental. This was not my daughter finding a random phone and taking a chance. Someone had planned this call at least 6 months in advance. Someone had purchased access, set it up, handed it to my daughter for just long enough to say 4 words, and then made certain the line would die before I could respond. That level of calculation did not terrify me the way you might expect. What it did was clarify something I had been too consumed by grief to understand for 11 years. Whoever had taken Nadia was not impulsive. They were patient. They planned in long stretches of time, and they covered their tracks with the confidence of someone who had done it before. I kept pulling threads. The prepaid phone account had been registered using an email address. My carrier could not give it to me directly, but a contact I had from years of professional dealings pointed me toward the right person to ask. By afternoon I had the email domain. By evening I had matched it to a purchase location. The phone had been bought and activated at a convenience store in a small town I had never visited. A town called Graywell, 4 hours north of where I lived. I stared at that name on my screen for a long time. And then something surfaced from the back of my memory. Something I had not thought about in years. My sister Rachel had gone to college with a woman from Graywell. I remembered her mentioning it once. A roommate from some small town up north. I told myself it was a coincidence. I did not believe myself for a single second. I drove to the police station the next morning with a folder of printouts, a level voice, and exactly zero faith that anything useful would happen. But I went, because you exhaust every channel, because 11 years had taught me that the moment you stop trying a door is the moment you never know whether it might have opened. Detective Holt had been assigned to Nadia's cold case for the better part of a decade. I had met him in the early years, when there was still an active search, when people still used the word hope without flinching when they said it to me. He looked older now. We both did. I laid everything on the table between us without drama or emotion, just facts in sequence. The phone call. The number. Patricia Hale. The prepaid purchase in Graywell. He listened. He nodded. He wrote things in a notepad in the unhurried way of a man who already knows he will not be looking at those notes again. When I finished, he folded his hands on the table and told me, with the practiced gentleness of someone who had delivered this particular speech many times to many mothers, that grief was a powerful thing. That audio memory could be remarkably unreliable after years of longing. That the department would look into it and be in touch. I watched his face while he said these words. And I saw it. Just briefly, just beneath the surface of his professional sympathy, the way you see something move under shallow water before it disappears again. It was not skepticism. It was not dismissal. It was discomfort. The very specific discomfort of a man who already knows something he has made a decision not to say. I thanked him and walked out of the station and sat in my car in the parking lot with my hands in my lap and my eyes straight ahead. I opened my phone and typed one sentence into my notes. Holt already knew. That evening, I checked my phone carrier account to look at the records I had pulled. A small notification had appeared. Someone had accessed my account from an unidentified device. Not me. Not anyone I had authorized. Someone knew I was looking. Someone was already watching me before I had fully begun. I have kept every voicemail Nadia ever left me. Every single one. When she had been missing for 2 years and I became terrified the phone carrier would eventually purge their records, I transferred them all to a digital audio file and backed it up in 3 separate places. I am an accountant. I understand the importance of keeping things that cannot be replaced. I had listened to those voicemails hundreds of times. Never as an investigator. Always as a mother, sitting in the dark, letting her voice fill the silence that her absence had made permanent. That night I listened differently. I closed my eyes and I filtered out my daughter's voice entirely, and I listened instead to everything behind it. The ambient sounds. The background noise that a 16-year-old girl talking casually into a phone would never think to conceal. The last voicemail she left me was recorded the afternoon before she disappeared. 43 seconds long. She sounded the way teenagers sound when their mind is partly somewhere else, distracted and affectionate at the same time. She said she would be home by 6. She needed money for a school trip. She loved me, in the easy, unguarded way children say it when love still feels like something that requires no maintenance. At the 11-second mark, behind her voice, was a sound. Wind chimes. Low and slightly uneven, the kind produced by a homemade set with tubes of varying lengths rather than a uniform store-bought one. I had no wind chimes. I never have. Which meant Nadia was not at home when she made that call. She was somewhere else, calling me from someone else's space, and she did not want me to know that. I closed my eyes and moved back through every memory I had of wind chimes. The list was short and specific. One entry made my chest tighten so sharply I had to press my hand flat against the table to steady myself. My sister Rachel had a set of homemade wind chimes on her back porch. I had commented on them once, years ago. She had told me she made them herself, tubes she had cut and hung from a piece of driftwood. She had seemed pleased that I noticed. I opened Rachel's social media profile. She had kept it public for years, the carefully curated life of a woman who wanted to be seen as content. Photographs of comfortable rooms and weekend outings and a general atmosphere of ease. I scrolled through until I found the most recent post. It was from 2 weeks ago. Rachel at a small-town diner, smiling at the camera with the relaxed expression of someone exactly where they want to be. I did not sleep again that night. By morning I had made a decision that I should have made 11 years ago. I was not putting this in anyone else's hands. Not the police, not the system, not anyone who had already demonstrated that the space between knowing and acting was one they were comfortable occupying indefinitely. I drove downtown to a building I had passed 100 times without stopping. 3rd floor. Frosted glass door. A simple sign with plain black letters. Private investigations. The man behind the desk was in his 60s, sharp-eyed, economical with words. He looked up when I entered and studied me without speaking. I sat down without being invited to, and I told him what I needed. Not the backstory, not the years of grief, just the facts. The call. The dead woman's number. The prepaid purchase. The town. My sister's location tag. He listened without interrupting. When I finished he said, if what I was describing was accurate, this went beyond a missing persons case. This was the architecture of something constructed by someone with both patience and motive. I told him I already knew that. I told him I needed proof. Bank records, property records, communication records, documented connections between every person and every location I had mentioned. I wanted the truth not suspected but proven. He named a price. I did not flinch. I wrote the check. He called me back 2 hours later. He had confirmed Marcus Veal had a registered address in Greywell. He had lived there for 9 years. He had arrived 2 years after Nadia disappeared, which meant he had not taken her from our city himself. She had been brought to him. By someone. Through a chain of hands that someone had organized deliberately. My daughter had not simply vanished. She had been transferred. Like property. Like something that belonged to someone else. I sat with the phone in my hand after he hung up, and I felt something shift inside me. The grief that had lived in me for 11 years was not gone. But something had moved in front of it. Something colder and far more focused. I drove to Greywell on a Thursday morning. 4 hours of highway and then 2-lane roads lined with pine trees, the kind of place that appears suddenly between long stretches of nothing, as if the land is trying to keep it secret. I checked into a motel under a slight variation of my name and paid cash. I moved through the town slowly and without urgency, the way you move when you need people to see someone unremarkable. I visited the diner, the hardware store, the small pharmacy on the main road. At the pharmacy, an older woman named Greta was restocking shelves. I gave myself time to browse before I spoke to her. I told her I was looking for my niece, who I believed had moved to Greywell a few years back. I described Nadia in the present tense, guessing at the woman she would have become. 27 years old now. Dark hair, slight build. Kept to herself. Greta paused. She looked at the photograph I held out. And she said something that made my hand tighten on the shelf beside me. That young woman, she said carefully, came into the pharmacy sometimes. She was very quiet. She always paid with cash. And she always looked at the door when she entered, not the way most people do, scanning for someone they know. The way people look when they are checking whether they were followed. I asked Greta where she lived. She hesitated. I told her I was not looking for trouble. She wrote an address on a receipt and slid it across the counter without making eye contact, the gesture of someone who wanted to help and needed not to be seen doing it. I drove past the address. A pale yellow house at the edge of a residential street. Modest, ordinary. The kind of house that would not draw a second glance from anyone passing through. A man was sitting on the front porch. He was not reading. He was not on his phone. He was watching the street with the methodical, patient attention of someone whose job is the watching itself. I did not slow down. I kept my eyes forward and drove past and turned 2 streets over and sat in my parked car until my breathing steadied. That man was standing between me and my daughter. I needed to understand exactly what he was before I moved any closer. I parked 2 streets away and waited. The discipline required to simply sit still when my daughter was within a few hundred feet of me is something I do not have adequate words for. It was the hardest physical thing I have ever done. But I knew that one wrong move, one moment of running toward her without understanding the full shape of the danger surrounding her, could make everything worse. An hour passed. Then the front door opened and a woman stepped out. She was wearing a plain jacket. Her hair was darker than I remembered, cut shorter. She carried herself with the particular self-containment of someone who had learned, over a very long time, to take up as little space as possible, to be unnoticeable, to move through the world as if apologizing for the space she occupied. But the walk was Nadia's walk. The slight forward lean. The way her left arm swung fractionally more than her right. A gait I had memorized across years of watching her cross parking lots and school hallways and our kitchen every single morning. You cannot disguise the way your body moves. It is written too deeply. A mother's knowledge of her child is recorded in details that no amount of time can fully erase. The man followed behind her. 1 step back. He did not hold her hand. He held her elbow. There is a difference between those 2 things, and anyone who has ever felt genuinely controlled by another person understands exactly what that difference feels like to witness. I watched them walk to a corner store and return. When they came back to the house, he went inside first. And in the 2 seconds that Nadia stood alone on the porch before following him through the door, she looked up. Not toward me. Toward the sky. The expression on her face in those 2 seconds was not sadness. It was exhaustion. The deep, structured exhaustion of a person who has been holding themselves rigidly still for so long that stillness has become their only available posture. I sat in my car until darkness came. I was crying, but I did not know it until I reached up to adjust my mirror and found my face was wet. My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. 3 words only. Stop. Go home. I looked up and down the empty street. Whoever sent that message knew exactly where I was parked. I did not go home. I confirmed the following morning that Marcus left the house at 7:40. I watched him go. I waited 25 minutes. Then I walked to the front door of the yellow house and knocked once. Silence. I knocked again. Footsteps. Slow and careful, the footsteps of someone deciding. The door opened 3 inches. The chain remained on. One eye appeared in the gap and looked at me. My daughter's eye. I watched something happen in it. Something break open very quietly, the way ice cracks before it gives way entirely. The chain came off. The door swung inward and Nadia pulled me inside with both hands and pressed her back against the closed door and stood there breathing, fast and shallow, her eyes on the space around me rather than on me, checking, always checking. I reached for her. She gripped my hand so hard it hurt, and I was glad for it. I needed to feel something real. You shouldn't have come, she whispered. He's going to know. I took her face in both my hands. I looked at her the way I had looked at her photograph every day for 11 years. She was 27 years old. My daughter, who had been 16 when someone took her from me, was 27 years old and standing in front of me, and she was alive. Her eyes were full, terrified. And underneath the terror, recognizable to me the way her walk was recognizable, was something she had been carrying quietly for a very long time. Fury. Patient, carefully managed, long-stored fury. "I have maybe 20 minutes, she said. "So listen to me. There are things you think you understand. You don't. Not yet. And when I tell you, Mom," she paused and looked at me directly, "when I tell you who did this, I need you not to make a sound." I nodded. She said the name. It was not Marcus. It was not a stranger. It was not anyone I had ever suspected, despite everything, because some betrayals are too close to the face to see clearly until someone turns on a light. It was Rachel. My sister. Nadia spoke the way someone speaks when they have rehearsed a conversation so many times in their mind that it has become almost clinical. She had imagined telling me this story for years. She had lived inside it for years. She had gone over and over every detail until she could deliver it without collapsing, because collapsing was a luxury that the life she was living had never made room for. The day before she disappeared, Rachel came to her school. Not to the front gate, not to the office. To the side street where Nadia always cut through to reach the bus stop. A route only someone who knew her routine well would know to use. Rachel told her I had asked her to come. That there had been an accident. That they needed to go immediately. Nadia was 16 years old. She trusted her aunt. There was no accident. There was a car and a drive that went in the wrong direction, and then a story that was delivered slowly and carefully, the way you would lay out evidence for someone who needs to be convinced of something they would otherwise never believe. Rachel told my daughter that I did not want her anymore. That I had been in the process of making arrangements to transfer her care elsewhere. She showed Nadia documents. Nadia was a teenager. She had no way to know what forged paperwork looked like. She believed them because the alternative, that her mother would do such a thing, was too enormous to sit beside the forgery and compare carefully. Sometimes the most convincing lies are the ones too painful to examine. Rachel had even rehearsed the tears. For 2 years she moved Nadia between trusted contacts, people embedded in a network Nadia only partially understood. During those 2 years, Rachel fed my daughter a slow and steady drip of fabricated evidence that I had moved on. That I had stopped searching. That I had continued living as if she had never existed. By the time Nadia was old enough and strong enough to question the story, the isolation had already done its work. And Marcus was there. Always there. Quiet and patient and already prepared. I sat across from my daughter and listened to every word with my hands folded in my lap and my face as still as I could manage. Then I asked the question I needed answered most. Why now, Nadia? Why did you call me now, after all this time? She looked down at her hands. When she looked up her eyes were steady, but something in them was very close to the surface. Because I found out what Rachel gets when I disappear permanently, she said. And I think Marcus is already getting ready to make that happen. I drove back to the motel and called my investigator. I told him everything Nadia had said, in sequence, without emotion, the same way I would present financial irregularities to a client. He listened in complete silence, and when I finished he was quiet for a moment in the way of someone reorganizing a map they thought they had understood. He spent the next 4 hours pulling every financial record he could legally access. What he found, compiled in a document he sent to my inbox by midnight, was the thing that turned Rachel's cruelty from personal into calculated. Our mother had died 8 years ago. Her estate consisted primarily of a property portfolio and a family trust worth just under $3 million. The will left everything to me as primary beneficiary, with Rachel receiving a secondary and considerably smaller amount. Rachel had contested the will through her attorney and lost. But embedded in the trust documents was a clause I had never thought to scrutinize. When you are drowning in grief, you sign what your lawyer puts in front of you and you trust that the details are what they say they are. The clause stated that if I died without a living heir, or if my sole child was declared legally dead, the trust would restructure. The secondary beneficiary would absorb the primary share. Nadia had been declared legally dead 4 years after her disappearance. I had been too devastated and too ground down by years of searching to fight the timeline aggressively. I had signed the paperwork in a fog of grief I now understood, with ice-cold clarity, was a fog that Rachel had engineered from the beginning. With Nadia legally dead, the only thing standing between Rachel and $3 million was me. I sat at the desk in that motel room and read through the documents a second time. Then a third. I am thorough by profession and by nature. Then my investigator sent one final attachment. A wire transfer record. 3 months ago, Rachel had sent Marcus Veal $40,000. The memo field contained 2 words. Final arrangement. My investigator called me the next morning at 6, and the flatness in his voice told me before the words did that what he had found was serious. Marcus Veal was not a small or petty kind of dangerous. He was the systematic kind, which is considerably worse. Over 15 years, across 2 states, at least 3 other women had entered periods of documented vulnerability and subsequently become, for all practical purposes, invisible. 2 of them had eventually surfaced. 1 never had. Marcus had never been charged, because the women either could not testify or recanted under circumstances my investigator described with careful neutrality, though the meaning was clear enough. He did not leave visible marks. He was a practitioner of the kind of control that operates through isolation and manufactured dependency and the slow, patient erosion of a person's sense of what is normal. He maintained the appearance of an unremarkable man with an unremarkable life in a small, quiet town, and the community around him saw nothing because he had arranged it precisely so there was nothing obvious to see. The $40,000 transfer was the detail my investigator returned to at the end of the call. He had analyzed payment structures like this before, in a previous case from his time in federal work. It was not a retainer. It was not ongoing maintenance money. The structure of it, the timing, the amount, was consistent with a completion fee. Payment rendered in advance for a specific, final outcome. Rachel had not paid Marcus to continue keeping Nadia hidden. She had paid him to end Nadia's story entirely. How much time do we have? I asked. He said he estimated weeks. Possibly less. I asked him how I got my daughter out before Marcus moved. He said there was an FBI contact he trusted completely, but that using federal channels meant surrendering control of the timeline, which meant Marcus would have enough notice to disappear. He also told me the other thing. The thing that explained Detective Holt's expression in that police station, that flicker of discomfort behind the professional gentleness. Based on communication records my investigator had obtained, someone inside the local police department had been feeding information to Marcus for years, telling him when inquiries came in, telling him when grieving mothers came asking questions, keeping the path clear. That someone was Holt. I sat with that information for exactly 1 hour. Then I called Detective Holt. I did not confront him. I made my voice soft and slightly defeated, exactly what a woman looks like when she has finally accepted that the grief was lying to her all along. I told him he had been right. That I had been through too much and heard what I wanted to hear. That I was going home and going to focus on healing. I could hear the relief move through him when I said it, like a breath he had been holding for days finally being let go. I hung up and felt the cold, quiet weight of understanding just how thoroughly the system I should have been able to trust had been arranged against me. For how many years had Holt been the mechanism that ensured no search came close enough to matter? How many case reviews had he quietly steered away from anything productive? How many walls between me and my daughter had he helped build and then stood in front of, wearing the expression of a man who simply had no leads to give? I was done being angry about it. Anger requires energy, and I had other things to spend mine on. I called the FBI contact my investigator had recommended. Agent Serrano answered on the second ring. She told me Baxter had already briefed her. Her voice was direct and uncluttered, the voice of someone who moved from information to action without a lot of space in between. "Tell me what you need," she said. I told her. She said she could give me 48 hours before she had to move through official channels. After that she could not control what happened. That evening I returned to the motel and found my room door not quite as I had left it. I had developed the habit of leaving a small piece of paper wedged at a specific height in the doorframe, A trick I had read about somewhere and adopted without much faith it would ever matter. The paper was on the floor. On my pillow, placed with deliberate and unhurried care, was a photograph. It was a photograph of me, taken through the front window of the yellow house, from outside, on the morning I had gone inside to see my daughter. Someone had been watching the house from the street while I was inside. Someone had photographed me through the glass. And that someone had gone to the effort of placing the photograph on my pillow to ensure I understood exactly how much they could see. I photographed the photograph, sent it to my investigator and to Serrano, checked out of the motel, drove to a different one 3 towns over, and checked in under a different name. I was not afraid. I want to be clear about that. I was not afraid. I was more awake than I had been in 11 years. The woman who had spent 11 years crying in an empty house had been replaced, somewhere over the previous days, by someone I barely recognized in motel bathroom mirrors but who felt, for the first time in a very long time, like myself. I called Rachel. I had not spoken to her in over a year. Our relationship had become the strained, obligatory kind that grief and accumulated silence erode down to almost nothing. I kept my voice warm and slightly fragile, exactly what she would expect from me. I told her I had been struggling, that something had unsettled me and I needed to talk to someone I trusted. I heard the fluency with which she offered herself as that person, the immediate warmth, the expressions of concern that arrived without hesitation, perfectly formed, because she had been performing them for 11 years and was very good at it by now. We agreed to meet the following day at a restaurant she chose, which told me she wanted control of the environment. I arrived early and found a corner table with sightlines to the door. I was wearing a small audio recorder in my jacket pocket. I had practiced keeping my hands still until they looked natural even when they were not. Over 90 minutes I let her talk. I asked about our mother's estate with the confusion of a woman sorting through paperwork she did not quite understand. I asked about Nadia's legal declaration of death with the tone of someone who still found the subject painful but was trying to make practical peace with it. I asked whether she ever thought we had given up the search too soon. Rachel answered every question with the ease of someone who has long since stopped being nervous about what she carries. Guilt, I have found, becomes manageable once a person decides the other party will never know. It loses its teeth. It settles into something almost comfortable. At minute 64, when I asked that last question about giving up the search, Rachel's answer contained 3 sentences that no explanation could make innocent. 3 sentences that, on a recording, would speak for themselves with perfect clarity. I drove back to the motel. My phone rang before I reached the highway. It was a number I did not recognize. I answered. Nadia's voice came through, barely above a whisper, pressed close and urgent against the phone. Mom. He knows you're here. He's moving me tomorrow night. I pulled over immediately and called Serrano before the car had fully stopped. I gave her the situation in 15 seconds, the way she had told me to if urgency required it. She said she could have federal assets in Graywell within 3 hours, but that moving through official channels meant warrant processing, jurisdictional confirmation, and interagency notifications. It would create noise. And Marcus, who had demonstrated 11 years of operational patience, would have enough warning to disappear with my daughter before anyone reached the front door of that yellow house. I asked what the unofficial option looked like. There was a pause on the line. The specific pause of someone who is calculating risk against outcome. Then she said, I can drive there myself. Personally. In about 2 hours. That's not official. That's just me making a drive. We met at a gas station outside Graywell in the early evening. She was younger than I expected, dark-haired and precise in all her movements, the kind of person who has calibrated every gesture toward efficiency. She reviewed everything in the car, the investigator's files, Rachel's recording, the photograph left on my pillow, the wire transfer to Marcus. She confirmed what my investigator had found about Holt. She looked at me when she was finished, directly and without softening it. You understand that if we go in tonight without backup and something goes wrong? I understand, I said. Let's talk about how we go in. Nadia had given me one critical piece of information during that whispered phone call. Marcus left the house every Tuesday night between 9 and midnight. A standing routine. A small-town pattern he had maintained long enough to stop thinking of it as a vulnerability. Tonight was Tuesday. At 8:50 p.m. we watched his car pull out of the driveway. Relief moved through me for exactly 4 seconds. Then a second car, one I had never seen parked at the property before, turned onto the street and pulled up in front of the house. Someone had been sent to stay. The second car belonged to a man Serrano identified within 4 minutes of running the plate. He had a minor record, the kind that suggests a person available for tasks that require presence rather than skill. Serrano made a call. She stepped out of the car and spoke quietly into her phone for approximately 90 seconds. 2 minutes later, his phone rang. He answered. His posture changed. He started his car and drove away. I did not ask what she said to him. Some information is better appreciated without specifics. We approached the house from the side, moving through a neighboring yard whose gate was unlocked, stepping carefully and quietly across the grass. At the back door I knocked in the pattern Nadia had told me to use. 3 quick. 2 slow. Silence. Then footsteps. The door opened and my daughter was already dressed, a bag over her shoulder, her eyes moving to Serrano and back to me with the rapid assessment of someone who has learned to read danger in seconds and act before the assessment finishes. She looked at Serrano, she nodded once, and she stepped outside without looking back at the house behind her. We moved quickly to the car. When we were inside and moving, I reached across the seat and took her hand. She let me. She gripped it tightly and we drove in silence for a long time, putting Graywell behind us in the dark, and I did not feel the need to fill the silence with anything because having her next to me was already more than I had allowed myself to believe would ever happen. After several miles she turned toward me. Her voice was steady. Her hands were not. Mom. There's something else I need to tell you. Something I need you to be ready for before I say it. I kept my eyes on the road. I'm pregnant, she said. 4 months. He doesn't know. I gripped her hand until my knuckles ached. I did not cry. I did not speak immediately. I let the information settle into me fully, and then I made a promise to myself so deep it had no language. Whatever came next, I would be there for all of it. Okay, I said. You're safe now. We handle everything else from here. We were 40 miles from Graywell when my phone rang. I looked at the screen. Rachel. I stared at her name for 3 seconds. Nadia looked at me. I answered. The warmth was gone from my sister's voice. What remained was something stripped down and direct, the voice of a person who has been managing a situation and made the decision to stop pretending. I know you found her, Rachel said. Do you? I replied. You need to think very carefully about your next move. The tone she used was practiced. She had used it before, with other people, in other situations where she needed someone to feel that they were in less control than she was. There are things that could complicate this significantly. Details about the years Nadia spent with Marcus. Things that would be difficult for her, very publicly difficult, if they came out through the wrong channels. She paused to let it land. Or, she continued, we handle this quietly. You take your daughter. I take what's mine from the trust. Everyone walks away and gets to move forward. She let that offer sit in the air between us. I waited until the silence was long enough to be intentional. Then I said, Rachel, this is the second recording I've made of you in 3 days. She hung up. I looked at Nadia. She was watching me with an expression I had not seen on her face before. Something close to wonder. I called Serrano and played her the recording. She listened to the end and said the 2 sentences that told me the final chapter had begun. I'm making the call. Federal warrants within the hour. For Rachel. For Marcus. And for Holt. I know the approximate time Rachel was taken into custody because Serrano texted me one word at 6:17 in the morning. Done. I was sitting in a hotel room with Nadia asleep in the bed beside me. I read the word in the dim light, and I closed my eyes and I allowed myself to feel the thing I had been holding back for 2 weeks. Not triumph. Not satisfaction. Something more complicated than either of those. The sensation of a weight that had been pressing against me for 11 years finally lifting off. Marcus was picked up in Greywell at the same hour. A neighbor, seeing the federal vehicles, had called to warn him, and Marcus was 3 blocks from his house in his car when 2 vehicles blocked him in. He did not resist. Men like Marcus rarely do when the structure of power runs in the opposite direction. He had used authority as a tool for years. Having it turned against him left him with nothing to perform. Detective Holt resigned before his formal suspension could be processed. His resignation letter contained no apology and no explanation. Just the bureaucratic language of a man disconnecting himself from something that had become inconvenient. I filed a formal complaint against him regardless. Some things belong on permanent record whether or not they produce the outcome you would choose. By noon, my attorney had filed the civil claims. Fraud. Forgery. Financial exploitation. Conspiracy. Wrongful manipulation of estate documents. Emotional damages measured across 11 years of manufactured grief. My investigator called me in the afternoon. Routine follow-up, he said. But his voice had a quality to it that made me wait. During Rachel's formal interview, before her attorney could halt the process, she had made a statement. She said the original plan, the plan to take Nadia, had not been entirely her own idea. Someone had suggested it first. Someone, she said, had as much financial motivation as she did. Someone I had trusted completely and grieved alongside for 11 years. She said it was Carl, Nadia's father. Carl had been peripheral to my life for years. Our divorce when Nadia was 12 had been the amicable kind, held together by the effort of 2 people trying not to damage their child any more than the separation already would. He had remarried. He had built a different life. He had sat beside me at Nadia's memorial service and wept, and I had been grateful for his presence because whatever had divided us, I believed we shared at least the truest part of that grief. The investigation assembled the truth the way all unbearable truths arrive. In pieces. In documents. In dated records that connect across time into a shape that cannot be interpreted as anything other than what it is. Carl had known about Rachel's plan before it was carried out. He had not designed it with criminal precision. He had introduced it the way that weak men introduce terrible ideas, over drinks, in the language of grievance and frustration, framed just vaguely enough to maintain deniability afterward. He had complained about the terms of our arrangement, about the trust, about the fact that Diane received everything and he received every other weekend. He had said, in whatever words he chose, that if things were different, the financial picture would be different too. Rachel had taken that seed and built an entire structure around it. And then she had used Carl's silence, year after year, as collateral. He knew too much to speak. He knew too much to be safe from her. So he had spent 11 years sitting in that particular prison of his own construction, attending memorials, bringing flowers, saying nothing. Serrano confirmed he would be charged as an accessory and co-conspirator in the concealment. The evidence was sufficient. He would not escape on a technicality. That evening I sat with Nadia and told her about her father. I watched her face as I spoke. I was expecting shock. I was prepared to hold her through it. But what I saw instead stopped me. She was not shocked. "I know, Mom," she said quietly. "I've known for a while. Marcus kept letters. Dad sent money. Every year. He said it was to keep things stable." She paused. "He was paying to keep me hidden." She said it without drama, the way you say something you have long since finished grieving. She had carried that too. She had carried everything. I reached for her hand. We sat together in the quiet of that hotel room, and neither of us tried to make it anything smaller than what it was. The federal case built over the months that followed, and I stepped back from the center of it deliberately, because it was no longer my story to carry alone. It had never only been my story. It had always been Nadia's, and she was finally in a position to tell it herself, in her own words, in a room where the people listening were required by law to take her seriously. She gave her formal statement over 2 days. She sat in a chair across from Serrano and a victim's advocate and the attorney I had hired before Nadia even thought to ask for one, and she spoke for hours. She was precise. She was deliberate. She was exhausting to witness in the way that only comes from watching someone release pressure that has been compressed inside them for longer than it should have been possible to contain. She did not cry during the formal process. She cried afterward, in private, in the ways and at the time she chose, and I learned during those months that the most important thing I could offer my daughter was a specific kind of presence. Close. Quiet. Available without being demanding. I had waited 11 years. I could wait for her to come to me at whatever pace felt safe. Her testimony was the spine of the prosecution's case, because she had more than her words. She had evidence. Letters Marcus had kept, thinking they posed no risk to him. Dates and sequences and details that corroborated every document my investigator had assembled. She had been collecting it for years, quietly and carefully, the way a person survives when escape is not yet possible but preparation is. She had been building a case from inside the Yellow House, in whatever small moments of privacy she could secure, waiting for a window. I asked her once, during a quiet afternoon, when she had started keeping records. She looked at me with an expression I will carry for the rest of my life. "About a year after I stopped believing you had given me up," she said. "Once I knew the truth, I knew I'd need proof. I just didn't know how long it would take to get it to you." She had never fully stopped believing in me. She had been surrounded for years by people working very hard to replace that belief with something that served them better, and she had never let them fully succeed. 3 weeks before the trial was set to begin, Nadia went into labor 5 weeks early. I drove through the night and arrived 20 minutes before my granddaughter was born. I stood at the side of my daughter's bed in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and newness and held her hand through the last of it. When it was over and the room was quiet and the baby was in her arms, Nadia looked at me with the particular exhaustion of a woman who has just done something enormous on top of something else that was already enormous. "I want to name her after you," she said. "Is that okay?" I had not allowed myself to fully cry since the night of the phone call. I had been deliberate about it, saving myself for the things that required me to function. But in that room, with my daughter's eyes on me and a new life in her arms, I finally did. Quietly, and for a long time. Rachel received 7 years. Carl received 4, reduced for cooperation. Marcus received 14 federal charges across multiple counts, and 2 other women's cases were reopened as a direct result of what Nadia's testimony made visible. I do not know their names. I hope each of them has someone in their corner who refused to stop looking. Detective Holt was convicted on 2 counts. His retirement funds were absorbed into restitution. I felt nothing specific about that outcome. Only the flat, appropriate completion of a thing that needed to be completed. The trust was fully restored and returned to its rightful status. I set aside a portion I had decided from the beginning I would not touch. I placed it in an account in my granddaughter's name and wrote a single note to accompany the paperwork. For a life that starts with the truth already waiting. Nadia and I do not talk every single day. We talk when we want to, which turns out to be more often than either of us predicted. We are learning each other across a distance that is partly 11 years and partly the ordinary distance that exists between any 2 people who love each other and are figuring out how to do that in real time, in a life that is genuinely being lived rather than survived. Some days it comes naturally. Some days it takes work. All of it is worth it. I visited the cemetery once more, months after everything was settled. Not to mourn Nadia, who was alive and feeding her daughter and building a life in a house I helped her find, in a city close enough for me to reach in an afternoon. I went to stand at the marker bearing her name, the one that had been placed there during the worst years, and to look at it for a final time. It had never been a grave. It had been a lie someone told about my daughter's existence. A piece of marble carved with a false ending. I stood there for a few minutes. Then I turned and walked back to my car. I drove to my daughter's house. The kettle was on when I arrived. The baby was asleep. The door was unlocked because no one inside that house was hiding from anyone anymore. I sat at Nadia's kitchen table and drank tea and listened to the ordinary sounds of a life being lived without fear, and I let myself understand something I had not fully permitted myself to understand before. She had survived 11 years because she refused to disappear. And I had searched 11 years because I refused to accept that she had. We had each been doing the same thing in the dark, without knowing the other was doing it too. Holding on. Refusing to let the lie become permanent. The phone call that started all of this lasted 4 seconds. One word. My name in my daughter's voice at 2:47 in the morning, transmitted through a dead woman's number from a town I had never heard of. 4 seconds was all it took. For seconds to begin the unraveling of 11 years of carefully constructed deception. What was taken was time. What was returned was everything that mattered. And what was built in the space that opened up afterward, slowly, imperfectly, with love as the only blueprint and truth as the only foundation, could never be taken again. Because it had not existed before. We made it ourselves. Together. And it was ours.